Welcome back to the Cluey Podcast, where we help conscious consumers like you get clueyed into the latest conscious tips, topics, and brands from impact-driven founders to experts and thought leaders on the topic at hand. I'm Maryclaire, your host and founder of Cluey. Let's get clueyed in. Today's topic, why everyone is now talking about gas stoves and indoor air pollution. To discuss this, our guest today is Dr. Kelsey Bilsback, who is the senior scientist at PSE Healthy Energy. PSE Healthy Energy, also known as Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy, is a multidisciplinary nonprofit research institute that studies the way energy production and use impact public health, climate, and the environment. PSE is listed as a trusted resource by the Nobel Prize-winning Physicians for Social Responsibility and the Maryland Environmental Health Network. In addition to being PSE's senior scientist, Dr. Kelsey Bilsback was an author on the recent PSE study that found gas leaks from stoves in California can reach hazardous levels. Kelsey, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. And before we dive into our topic at hand, tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into this field and the work that you do specifically at PSE.
Yeah, so I've been interested in science and math for as long as I can remember, but I think I really got interested in air pollution during grad school. So my advisor asked me if I wanted to go travel around the world to measure air pollution, and I think I was mostly excited about the opportunity to travel at that time, but this experience really influenced how I thought about air pollution and how it impacts my health. So basically, I was tasked to measure smoke from cook stoves. And so basically those are these essentially open fires where people burn things like coal, wood, and even animal dung. And this usually happens in low and middle income countries. And so I was setting up my instruments in people's homes and measuring people almost literally cooking over a campfire, and my eyes were watering and I was getting a sore throat and coughing just from taking these measurements. So it was really staggering to me. Fast forward a few years, and now I'm a senior scientist at PSE Healthy Energy, and we are a nonprofit research institute. We look at things related to energy production and use and are trying to develop evidence-based solutions to support healthier communities, to support equity, and to lower risk from climate change. And my research continues to look at air pollution and health, and I've studied a range of different things from power plants to wildfires to tanker ships and to gas stoves, which I know we're here to talk about today.
Yeah. Well, no, that's fascinating that it's so full circle for you in your story. And I can't imagine a better expert to be speaking to us about this topic and helping all of our listeners who, are probably hyper aware at this point that there's something going on in the world of gas stoves. And for our listeners who aren't aware, essentially in the last few months, we've had a large surge of interest in the topic of gas stoves specifically. And the reason for that is that new research has come out indicating in some cases that gas stoves are to blame for respiratory illnesses. Now, this research, not necessarily PSE's research that I referenced earlier, other research that has been coming out, but this research has been put into question by various people from differing ideological political parties, different ideological thoughts. But this research has done one thing. It has created quite a stir, and it has added a sense of urgency to the Consumer Product Safety Agency in the United States to actually move towards regulation towards gas stoves. Well, anytime regulation comes up, it's going to be a bit controversial. And that's what's happening right now, is there's a lot of back and forth on what's going on in the world of gas stoves, and are they actually causing our health to deteriorate from indoor air pollution? So, Kelsey, tell us what's going on.
So, I'm a scientist, so I always turn to the science. And what we can see from multiple studies is that gas stoves can really impact your health. And so this can be happening when the stove is turned on and there's a flame. That then the stove can be creating nitrogen oxides, which are a respiratory irritant. When one of our recent studies showed that even when your stove is turned off, it can actually be leaking hazardous air pollutants, which are basically pollutants that are classified by the EPA as being harmful to human health. And those, an example of that is benzene. And so benzene is really concerning, and that can be leaking from your stove even when the stove is turned off. So we see that, there's these impacts. Gas stoves are essentially an emission source in your home. And so one of the best things that you can do to protect yourself is to actually get rid of that emission source.
Yep. Well, no, that's a pretty straightforward position there that you have based on the science that you've looked into. And let me just ask a few clarifying questions on that science. What's the context, right? Like, are we talking reaching hazardous levels of indoor air pollution or respiratory? What was the word you used? Respiratory irritants. Thank you. Yes, respiratory irritants when it's within a particular size of a home, when there's no like hood vent. Tell us like where the lines are drawn with some of this research that was conducted.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'll actually, talk specifically about the study that we conducted recently. So we went into homes in California and took samples of whole natural gas, so the gas that's directly in the stove, and then we did some air quality modeling. So we basically said we used data that show from another study on the rate that a stove could be leaking, or the amount that a stove could be leaking. And we combine that with our data on the hazardous air pollutants that could be in gas. And we were specifically looking at benzene. And so what we saw is that under the conditions of the leakiest stoves with the highest benzene concentrations, you could reach levels that the state of California determines are potentially harmful to your health for benzene. So under certain conditions, we really are seeing that this could be harmful. Got it.
And when you say like reaching hazardous levels, it is within the context of how the state of California has determined a level of certain toxins to be hazardous. How does a state or a government agency go about determining levels of hazard? Are they consulting scientists, independent research nonprofits like your organization? How is that determined?
So typically these levels are based on the body of scientific evidence. Take particulate matter PM 2.5. So particles less than 2.5 microns, for example. The EPA sets a level that's considered a threshold for outdoor air pollution, for example, and that's based on years and years and years of scientific evidence. And they will revisit those levels over time as more information comes online. So it's really based on a huge body of work from lots of different organizations.
That's great to hear, and very comforting to know that, it's not willy-nilly. Well, that's great. And thank you for kind of giving us the position that's come from the research that you've conducted, you and your team have conducted. Obviously, though, switching stoves is not something that a lot of consumers can do. Some people are renters and not homeowners, and maybe switching from a gas stove to induction or electric may not be possible. What would you say are some safety precautions that consumers can take if switching stoves or removing that emission from the home is not a feasible immediate solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think about lowering our exposure to air pollution, it's about reducing the amount of that air pollution over time. So without removing the source entirely, one thing you can do is actually reduce the amount of time you use that source. So if you can't replace your whole stove, one thing you could do is get like a cooktop that goes on your counter. You could get a tea kettle and maybe use that to boil water instead of using your gas stove. So that will help. Another thing you can do is increase the ventilation in your home. So that's that introduces clean air into the space that you're cooking, and that reduces the level of air pollution so that it's less harmful. And you can do that if ideally you have a range hood that, pulls those emissions directly outside and not back into your kitchen. But you can also, just increase your ventilation in other ways, like opening a window or doing something like that.
And I assume also keeping members of your household away from the source of the emission when it's not necessary as well, right? Because you mentioned that when they're turned off, they're even leaking potentially harmful chemicals at that point in time.
Yeah. So it's important, if you smell gas in your home or you hear some kind of leak, definitely contact your gas company or call 911, because if you smell gas, it's a potential explosion hazard. But there's also, your stove could also be leaking at levels that are much harder to detect, but still could be impacting your health, because as we've seen through our measurements, there's levels of hazardous air pollutants in gas itself. So if it's just leaking, some of that could be getting into your home, and the levels depends on lots of different things, but it's there. And benzene is actually from a cancer perspective has no safe level.
Okay, that's scary to hear. But we recently had a guest on our podcast talking about water pollution and filtered water, and in our water water systems, and how people can get certain chemicals in their drinking water. And one thing that was really helpful is he mentioned that there was a tool and a company that he knew of, that consumers could send a sample of their water to a lab to get it independently tested. You talk a lot about bringing tools and instruments in your research to measure this. Are there any things that individuals can do at the individual level in their home, whether it's by use of an instrument or some other method, to test, what levels of gas are leaking potentially from their gas stoves in their own home?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of the problem is that the right instruments are really research grade instruments, but there's some low cost sensors. They're not perfect, but they might provide some information. Another possibility is getting like a filter in your, like a portable filter. Those aren't perfect either. They do better for particles than gases, for example. And it's also really important to not get a filter that is an ionizing filter, because that can actually create ozone, and it kind of does the opposite of what you're hoping for it to do. But yeah, those portable filters can be a good thing. I know I live in Colorado, and we have a lot of issues with wildfire smoke. So I already have, a portable filter for high wildfire smoke days.
Yep. Well, no, those are great tips. Thank you for sharing those. And sounds like the best thing that you can do, if you have the ability to do it, is removing that source from the home in order to decrease that level of indoor air pollution. Besides indoor air pollution and air quality as it relates to at-home appliances like gas stoves, you do a lot of research on air quality and health outside of gas stoves. What's something about indoor air quality that most consumers don't know?
So I think one of the things that people don't realize is that air pollution sources are additive. So if you have multiple sources of air pollution, they can really add up and impact your total exposure, or what we call your cumulative exposure. So if you have, say, a gas stove and a gas fireplace, especially the ones that vent inside your home, those can add up. If there's, cigarette smoke, if there's candles, if there's incense, basically anything that combusts creates air pollution. So all of those sources can contribute to air pollution in your home.
That's super helpful. Super helpful to know. As someone who loves a good candle, I have to keep that in mind. Well, great, Kelsey. I found this super fascinating, super interesting. Obviously, it is a very controversial topic right now. As I mentioned, people from different sides of the aisle, so to speak, having different thoughts on this. We always think that it's best to go straight to the science. So thank you for providing your scientific expertise on this matter. And we love to end our podcast with 2 regular questions. First is a glimmer of hope question, and that is, what is a new innovation in the world of impact that you're familiar with, that you're jazzed about right now?
So honestly, I'm really excited that people are asking about gas stoves and how they might impact their health. I think that's a big deal. And I'm glad people are at least talking about it. Another thing I'm really excited about is the fact that there's federal programs now that can actually help pay for a transition from a gas stove to an electric stove or induction stove. So that's really good to hear. I think something like $800 through the Inflation Recovery Act now. So just excited that the conversation is happening.
Yeah, and that, we talked about that this may not be an easy solution for most people to access, to just remove the stove in their home, but having access to some sort of cost reduction measures is great. So that's a great glimmer of hope there. And then our second question that we always end our podcast with, typically I ask our guests to rapid fire name 3 other brands that they love and that they purchase from, because we are a brand transparency platform first and foremost. But today, given your background, I'm actually going to ask you to list off 3 pieces of recent research on anything within the indoor or outdoor air pollution space that you think consumers should be aware of.
So I think the first one is the shameless self-promotion for the study we talked about today. So that was our California natural gas study, looking at what's in natural gas and how that could impact your indoor air quality. My colleagues also conducted a study in Boston, so looking at a little different area, but also looking at what's in natural gas. And then a report I'm really excited about that we actually just released last week was on energy affordability in Maryland. And as part of that report, we actually summarized the state of the science around indoor air quality, combustion, and energy efficiency practices and how they can impact indoor air quality.
And where can folks find those articles, that's easy to access?
Yeah, so those are all on our website, psehealthyenergy.org.
Awesome. Well, hopefully everyone listening will head on over there and get a little bit wiser on this topic at hand. Kelsey, thank you again so much for coming on our podcast to get our followers clued in about gas stoves and indoor air pollution.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. And thanks to all of our listeners who tuned in for this episode of the Cluey Podcast. Remember, come back next week to get clued into the latest in the world of conscious consumerism.